They say blood is thicker than water, but no one tells you how easily it can drown you. The first time my mother tried to erase me, she did it with a smile and a microphone. By the end of that night, I learned that silence can be sharpened into a weapon. My name is Nova William, and until that evening, I was the woman everyone underestimated on purpose. The gala was held on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan hotel, where the windows looked down on a city that never asked permission to survive. Crystal chandeliers burned overhead like artificial stars, and the room hummed with money, power, and curated laughter. My mother stood at the podium in a silver gown worth more than my car, basking in applause meant for her philanthropy, her legacy, her generosity. Then she saw me. Her smile tightened, polished and precise, the way surgeons prepare before cutting. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, lifting her champagne flute, "this is my daughter, Nova." Proof that even perfect planning sometimes produces disappointing results. Laughter rippled across the room, polite at first, then eager. I felt it land on my skin like cold rain. They thought it was humor. They didn't hear the years behind it. I stood near the back, dressed in black, invisible by design. I had learned long ago that blending in was safer than shining around her. She believed success was hereditary, that worth could be inherited like real estate. To her, my career in federal compliance wasn't noble. It was embarrassing. I didn't sculpt bodies or host fundraisers. I read fine print. I followed money. I noticed patterns. While she collected praise, I collected evidence. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't taken me 15 years to survive it. As the laughter faded, my mother continued, warming to the cruelty. She spoke about discipline, ambition, and how some people simply lacked the instinct to rise. Every sentence was a stone placed carefully on my chest. What she didn't know was that I hadn't come to beg for approval or hide in humiliation. I had come because her foundation's name had crossed my desk 6 months earlier, flagged in red, tagged urgent. I had come because the city she loved to dominate had finally given me jurisdiction. I slipped my hand into my jacket and felt the weight of my phone, solid and grounding. Somewhere between the applause and the insults, something inside me went calm, not angry, focused. That was the moment I understood the difference between revenge and accountability. One destroys, the other ends things permanently. The sound of my heels on marble was the only warning anyone got. Each step echoed like a heartbeat in the grand ballroom, slicing through the polite chatter and clinking glasses. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some wide with surprise, some already calculating whether I was about to cry, scream, or beg. They didn't know me. They had never seen me. To them, I was the quiet, forgotten daughter, the shadow behind my mother's spotlight. But I had learned long ago that visibility was a choice, and tonight, I was choosing to be seen. I reached the stage with measured calm, ignoring the gasp that slipped through the crowd. My mother froze mid-sentence, her hand clutching the microphone as if letting go would mean losing control of everything she had spent decades building. But control had been an illusion. She had never understood the rules of my world. I smiled, polite but razor-sharp, and took the microphone from her hand. The grip of the silver stem was solid, cold and real, a contrast to the warm, deceptive glow of her chandeliers. I turned toward the crowd, letting the anticipation stretch like a taut wire, until the silence became unbearable. "My mother is right about one thing," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the room with surgical precision. "I work with the city's most vulnerable populations," but she conveniently left out my job title. I paused, letting it sink. 300 people leaned forward, unconsciously repositioning themselves to hear more. My mother's lips parted in confusion, her perfectly applied lipstick quivering, like she wasn't sure if she could speak or even breathe. "I am the Director of Compliance for the State Philanthropy Board," I continued. "I hold the authority to approve or reject all major grants in this city. And, as it happens, your foundation, Mom, has applied for a $25 million Grant to fund your so-called center for. Excellence! I approve the preliminary. Review. I opened a sleek black folder I had brought under my arm, flipping to the first page. Every line, every number, every luxurious expense was highlighted in red. Imported furniture for executive suites. Extravagant private lobbies. Consultants with shell company at address as every cent misallocated. The room didn't just quiet, it froze. I could feel the air thicken, heavy with disbelief and horror. My mother's face, usually radiant with arrogance, went from smug to ashen gray in seconds. She didn't speak. She didn't breathe. The audience, which had been laughing at my expense less than 30 seconds before, now watched with mouths open, trapped between shock and awe. I closed the folder with a snap, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stunned silence. "You're not applying for public funds to line your own pockets," I said. "Your proposal is rejected." Effective immediately, I dropped the microphone with deliberate force, its thud punctuating the finality of my words. I didn't need to add drama. The room understood the magnitude. I stepped off the stage, shoulders squared, the eyes of hundreds following me like I was the only reality in a world of illusions. For 29 years I had been invisible to her, a ghost wandering through the periphery of her life. My accomplishments, my struggles, my very existence had been inconvenient details she could ignore with a turn of her head or a dismissive word. But tonight, under the chandeliers she had paid for with other people's money, it was impossible to ignore. I walked through the crowd like a hurricane wrapped in calm. Whispers followed me, a murmur of admiration, disbelief, and fear. People were realizing that the girl who had been written off as weak, naive, or irrelevant had been quietly building the kind of power no one could laugh off. I thought back to 10 years ago in her marble-laden office. I had brought my acceptance letter for a top graduate program in public administration, my hands trembling with hope. She glanced at it once, sighed, and tossed it onto the fire without a word. "Go ahead, ruin your life," she had said. That night, she tried to erase me, but fire doesn't only destroy. It reshapes, hardens, and purifies. While she spent decades polishing her ego and expanding her influence, I was working double shifts, taking night classes, saving every dollar I could, and mastering the labyrinth of laws, grants, and compliance procedures that now gave me authority over her empire. The audience had no idea of the years hidden beneath my calm exterior. I had not simply prepared an audit. I had prepared a strategy. I had waited, watched, and allowed her to believe her charm, her wealth, and her carefully constructed image would always shield her. And tonight, in front of the most important figures in the city, I turned her own gravestone against her. Every inflated invoice, every luxury expenditure, every shell company she had used to mask personal gain was documented, highlighted, and ready for federal scrutiny. She didn't see it coming, because she never imagined that the quiet daughter could ever be a force to reckon with. Her face, pale and taut, betrayed the first flicker of panic. She opened her mouth, probably to launch into a rehearsed tirade, to scream at me, to call security or her lawyers. But nothing she could say would undo the evidence I had meticulously compiled. My words carried the weight of law and accountability, not anger or vengeance. "This is not a personal attack," I told the room, my voice resonating with authority. "This is enforcement. This is oversight. And yes, your foundation, Mom, is in violation of multiple statutes, including misuse of charitable funds." I watched the way her hands shook as she gripped the podium, realizing that the power she had wielded for decades through money, influence, and fear had no jurisdiction here. The room, which had been a stage for her ego, was now a courtroom, and I was the judge and the jury. Not a single person dared interrupt. Not a single whisper could penetrate the storm I had orchestrated. My presence alone, silent and deliberate, was evidence that her reign of entitlement had limits. The irony of it all was delicious. She had spent years teaching the world that her name carried weight, that her approval was essential, that failure was a disease. And here she was, exposed, powerless, and unable to charm or intimidate. Her way out of consequences she had meticulously avoided acknowledging. The audacity of survival, of preparation, and his invisible persistence had finally turned the tide. Her panic didn't stay silent for long. After a moment of frozen disbelief, she stepped down from the podium, her silver gown swishing like a warning siren. I didn't flinch. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the tension, the raw edge between predator and prey. My mother's face had changed. The poised, imperious matriarch was gone, replaced by something smaller, desperate and unrecognizable. She had always believed fear could be manufactured with wealth and influence, but I had studied her carefully. Fear wasn't for sale, and authority wasn't inherited. It had to be earned. Tonight, I held both. You think this is funny? She hissed, her voice tight with rage, echoing off the walls like a whip. Her hands shot out, clutching at my arm, fingers sharp and determined. I didn't recoil. I had spent years learning not just how to survive her scrutiny, but how to control the moments that mattered most. My grip on her words, her movements, her ego was absolute. I allowed the contact to last for a heartbeat before pulling free. Each motion deliberate, controlled, rehearsed. "Let go," I said calmly, letting my voice carry over the gasp of the room. The microphone was irrelevant now. My presence alone was the instrument of authority. She staggered back, startled by my composure. For decades, she had trained everyone to respond to her anger with submission, but I had never been trained to obey. I was trained to anticipate, to document, to respond with precision. Every time she raised her voice or lashed out, I had noted patterns, weaknesses, and triggers. Tonight, every calculation I had made for years came to life. I knew exactly how to dismantle the persona she had crafted, brick by brick, in front of the people who once bowed to her charm. "Nova," but I had prepared for every avenue of attack. Her influence, her threats, even her desperation. Nothing she could say could negate the truth I held in my hands, the evidence I had gathered, the authority granted to me by law. I stepped closer, just enough that she could feel the calm radiating from me, the unshakable precision of someone who had spent years walking through fire. "You are not untouchable," I said. "You are accountable. Every cent, every contract, every inflated invoice you submitted is documented and filed. The federal authorities are aware. You can threaten, manipulate, or rage, but the law doesn't bend to arrogance." The syllables were deliberate, each one a measured strike. She had trained her life to command attention. Yet, here she was, powerless, exposed in the brilliance of her own false narrative. The crowd's whispers grew, not in disbelief anymore, but in awe. No one had ever seen her undone like this, and few had ever seen me, a shadow she had dismissed, step fully into the light and claim the space she had monopolized for decades. The irony, sharp and satisfying, was not lost on me. The woman who had built her empire on appearances, charm, and intimidation was being dismantled by the daughter she had deemed irrelevant. Her breathing grew ragged, and her attempts at bluster dissolved into tremors of fury and fear. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I let the evidence, the silence, and my presence do the work. For once, the spotlight didn't belong to her. It belonged to the woman she had tried to erase, and she realized, too late, that she had no escape. Her next move was predictable, but no less dangerous. In a burst of desperation, she reached for her phone, hands trembling like a leaf in a storm. Her eyes darted to mine, wild and calculating. "I still have leverage," she hissed. "You think your little authority will protect you? I know people. I control things. You'll regret this." The room went still, every eye now locked on the tension, as if they were waiting for a spark to ignite a firestorm. But I was prepared for every spark. I had anticipated her reach for digital weapons, her attempts at manipulation, even her desperation. Years of experience, training, and observation had taught me that panic rarely invents power. It only exposes weakness. She pressed a number, fingers hovering over the screen. and spat out a threat so cold it felt like ice against my skin. "Call her!" she demanded, voice cracking. "Call your grandmother. If anything happens to her, it's on you. I can ruin everything you've built." It was the first time I saw her vulnerability mix with malevolence. She believed that fear could be used as currency, but she had underestimated me. Calmly, deliberately, I placed my hand over hers and held it steady. "I moved her last Tuesday," I said softly, my words carrying the weight of unshakable authority. "Safe, secure, and beyond your reach. You can threaten, but you can't touch what I protect." The tension in her shoulders faltered, the wildness in her eyes dimmed slightly, and the room collectively exhaled, though no one dared break the fragile silence. I could see it in her face, the realization that her lifetime of privilege, manipulation, and intimidation had limits. The wealth she had counted on as armor was meaningless here. The power she had hoarded and wielded so ruthlessly was useless against evidence. Law and preparation. I had turned the game she thought she controlled into a trap, and she had walked right in, blind and self-assured. Every smug assumption, every dismissive glance she had ever given me, had been a miscalculation that led to this moment of vulnerability. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The daughter she tried to erase had not only survived, but had outmaneuvered her. Every shell company, every inflated contract, every misuse of funds had been meticulously documented, uploaded, and ready for immediate action. I had waited for the right moment, in the right audience, and I had struck. There was no panic on my part, only the precision of inevitability. Her empire of appearances and intimidation was crumbling under the weight of reality. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, eyes darting to the folder in my hands, then to the crowd, then back to me. She had been accustomed to controlling the narrative, to bending perception, to rewriting history to favor her image. Tonight, every tool she relied on was useless. Every influential contact, every whispered conversation, every network she had built could not shield her from accountability. She had underestimated the quiet observer, the invisible force she had ignored for decades. I pressed the advantage, letting each word land with precision. "The federal authorities are already aware," I said, my tone cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Your accounts, your expenditures, and your misrepresentation are under investigation. Your foundation's assets are frozen. Your access is terminated. Your empire cannot operate in the shadows anymore. The gala, the luxury, the appearances, there. All evidence of your own mismanagement." Each phrase was deliberate, measured, unstoppable. I didn't yell. I didn't panic. I simply spoke the truth, and the truth had power she had never possessed. By the time her trembling hands dropped the phone and slid uselessly to her sides, the room had absorbed every word, every revelation. The crowd of 300 had gone from stunned spectators to witnesses of an extraordinary reversal. The woman who had once ruled with fear and charm was exposed, powerless and exposed to consequences she had spent decades ignoring. And for the first time, I felt the clarity of absolute control, the satisfaction. That comes not from vengeance, but from rightful accountability. The moment justice arrives, it rarely announces itself with drama. It moves quietly, efficiently, like a machine finally switched on. I felt it before I saw it. The subtle shift in the room when power changed hands. Security stopped looking at me and started watching her. Phones appeared in discreet hands. Whispers weren't gossip anymore. They were calculations. People were already deciding how far away from my mother they needed to stand to avoid being burned by association. Influence is loud when it works, but when it fails, it collapses into silence. She backed away from me slowly, heels unsteady, eyes glassy and unfocused. "You planned this," she said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. For the first time in my life, she was looking at me not as a mistake or a disappointment, but as an opponent who had already won. "Of course I did," I replied. "You taught me how. You just never thought I was listening." The truth landed harder than any insult. Her greatest flaw wasn't cruelty, it was arrogance. She believed she was the center of every story, that no one else could possibly be writing one of their own. The elevator doors at the far end of the ballroom opened with a soft chime. Two men in dark suits stepped out, badges barely visible unless you knew where to look. Federal compliance officers. On time. Precisely on time. I hadn't needed to summon them dramatically. The paperwork had already been filed. The evidence already transferred. The wheels already turning. Justice doesn't need a spotlight. It prefers documentation. One of the agents met my eyes and gave a small, professional nod. That was all. Confirmation. Finality. My mother saw them a second later. Her body reacted before her mind did, shoulders collapsing, chin trembling, breath catching in sharp, shallow pulls. "This is a misunderstanding," she said weakly, as instinctively reaching for the tone that had saved her 100 times before. Charm, authority, control. None of it worked. The agents didn't rush. They didn't argue. They simply waited, because inevitability has patience. As they approached, the room seemed to shrink around her. The chandeliers felt too bright. The applause from earlier now a distant, mocking memory. I stepped back, giving the agent space, giving her exactly what she had denied me my entire life. Accountability without cruelty. I didn't need to humiliate her further. She had done that herself. One of the agents spoke quietly, explaining procedures, rights, next steps. I didn't listen. I was watching my mother's face as she realized something irreversible had happened. Not just the loss of money or reputation, but the collapse of the hierarchy she had built her identity on. She was no longer untouchable. She was just another name on a file. As they guided her away, she looked back at me one last time. There was no hatred left. Just confusion, maybe even regret. But regret is meaningless without change, and change was no longer my responsibility. I had done my part. I walked toward the exit alone. No applause followed me. No one stopped me. Outside, the city breathed as it always had, indifferent, alive, honest. For the first time, I felt light. Not triumphant, free. The rain had started by the time I reached the street. Tiny drops dotting my coat like sequins under the neon lights. Manhattan never waits for anyone, and tonight it reminded me why. The city moves fast, and nothing in its rhythm cares about grudges, wealth, or titles. I pulled my collar up, ignoring the chill, feeling something I hadn't in years. Clarity. For decades, I had been invisible, underestimated, dismissed, and yet here I was, standing in the wet glow of streetlights, the chaos behind me, knowing that the same rules of persistence, preparation, and patience that had saved me would continue to shape my life. I thought about my grandmother, safe in her new apartment far from the influence of my mother. She had spent years watching me endure humiliation silently, never intervening because she believed in letting me find my own strength. Tonight, her quiet wisdom was vindicated. I dialed her number from my phone, and her soft, trembling voice answered. "It's done," I said. "Everything's secure. She can't hurt us anymore." The relief in her tone was palpable, like a dam releasing centuries of pressure. It was not triumph that I felt. It was justice, delivered quietly, effectively, without ceremony, and without revenge. Walking down the rain-slicked sidewalk, I realized that survival had been my education. The invisibility I had endured, the dismissals and insults, had been the perfect training ground. Every late-night shift, every exhausted commute, every sleepless hour spent poring over spreadsheets and compliance. Audits had prepared me for this moment. I had mastered not just the law, but the art of being unseen until the moment of maximum impact. There is power in patience, in preparation, in knowing when to act and when to let someone else expose their own flaws. People often think justice requires confrontation, shouting, or chaos. They're wrong. Justice is often quiet, methodical, unrelenting. It's in the evidence collected, the timing chosen, the strategy executed flawlessly. My mother's empire was not undone by theatrics or malice. It was undone by the inevitable alignment of accountability, law, and preparation. Watching her escorted away by professionals was not satisfying. In a petty sense, it was confirmation that order, truth, and patience have weight far greater than any fortune or legacy. I paused under a street lamp, letting the rain soak through my coat. For the first time, I understood the subtle difference between power and influence. Influence is temporary, fueled by fear, charm, and wealth. Power is the ability to act effectively, even when no one notices you, and to shape outcomes that others take for granted. I had it now not because of money, connections, or ego, but because I had endured, learned, and acted decisively. And yet, as the city pulsed around me, I realized that life would not stop here. Challenges would arise, threats would appear, and attempts at undermining me would continue. But I had grown beyond fear, beyond anger, beyond the need for approval. I was no longer the girl who hid in shadows, nor the daughter who waited for permission. I was Nova William, and the world had just learned what it meant to be underestimated. As I continued down the empty street, the lights reflected off the wet pavement like stars scattered across the ground. I smiled softly, a quiet, private acknowledgement of all I had endured and all I had won. No one else needed to cheer. No one else needed to notice. I had stepped fully into my own life. And for the first time, it felt boundless, unstoppable, and mine. The days that followed moved with a strange clarity, as if the world itself had shifted slightly on its axis to accommodate my victory. I returned to my office, a modest suite in a government building, and the hum of fluorescent lights felt like a drumbeat of authority. Every file I touched, every email I opened, every report I signed carried more weight than ever before. My colleagues noticed the subtle change. Not arrogance, not showmanship, but a presence that demanded respect because it was earned, not granted. I didn't announce my triumph. I let it ripple outward quietly, like a stone dropped in a still pond. The agencies that once ignored my warnings, the bureaucrats who doubted my influence, all began to adjust their expectations. I had become the standard. The news had quietly leaked, as I had anticipated. Headlines danced along the edges of social media, major foundation under federal investigation and philanthropy. Scandal rocks Manhattan. Elite. But the narrative was precise, surgical, controlled. I didn't give interviews. I didn't gloat. My only role in the story was the meticulous, unemotional executor of the law. The world saw the fall, the chaos, and the consequences that they didn't see: the years of preparation, the quiet nights of work, the careful strategy that had allowed me to stay invisible until the perfect moment. That invisibility had become my greatest asset, the tool that turned the tide when visibility alone would have been a liability. I spent mornings reviewing compliance files, afternoons mentoring junior officers, and evenings cataloging lessons learned from the orchestration of the gala's confrontation. Every move my mother had made, every reaction, every attempt at manipulation, was now a case study for my team. The lessons were invaluable. Arrogance blinds. Visibility can be misleading. Patience amplifies influence. And preparation is more powerful than any inheritance. I had transformed my personal battle into a professional framework that others could follow, ensuring that no one else in the system could exploit the same vulnerabilities I had once endured. Even as the dust settled, I knew that vigilance was required. Power without attention is fragile, and I had no intention of being underestimated again. The remnants of my mother's empire-loyal staff, financial instruments, legal tricks still existed. And though the law would hold her accountable, I had to make sure no shadow of her influence lingered to disrupt the people I protected. My role had expanded overnight. I wasn't just a regulator. I was a guardian of integrity, a shield for those the system often ignored. The satisfaction came not from revenge, but from the knowledge that my work now directly protected lives and resources, converting a personal triumph into systemic impact. At home, I reflected on the distance I had traveled. From an overlooked, underestimated child to a woman who wielded authority with precision and patience. Every trial and insult had shaped me. There were no celebrations, no champagne toasting the victory. The satisfaction was private, internal, a calm awareness of capability and control. And I understood finally that true power doesn't need acknowledgement. It simply exists, steady and unshakable, until it is required. And yet, even with everything secured, I felt the echo of the past in small ways, a shadow of doubt, the faint ache of memories where I've once been dismissed. But those echoes no longer held me. They reminded me of how far I had come, and how carefully I had navigated every risk. My future was no longer a question. It was a continuum of influence, integrity, and control. I was no longer reactive. I was decisive, deliberate, unstoppable. The city moved around me like it had always done, indifferent and relentless. But I walked through it with a quiet certainty that had taken decades to earn. Every step was measured, deliberate, a declaration that the invisible girl had transformed into someone impossible to ignore. I reflected on the journey, not the victories, not the confrontations, but the years of preparation, the relentless persistence, and the careful cultivation of knowledge and patience. They had been my weapons long before the gala. Long before my mother realized that I wasn't weak or insignificant. Those years had shaped me, forged me, and finally delivered me to this moment. The apex of clarity, authority, and resilience. I thought about the people I had been protecting, the vulnerable populations whose lives depended on integrity and oversight. My triumph was never truly about revenge. It was about accountability, justice, and the unwavering principle that power should not exist without responsibility. Every fraudulent invoice my mother had submitted, every shell company she had created, every attempt at manipulating reality had been neutralized. The system, which she had tried to bend to her vanity, now moved with precision, ensuring that resources went where they belonged, and that corruption could no longer hide behind charm or wealth. I had turned personal pain into systemic impact, and in doing so, I had claimed a form of power far greater than money or influence, the power to shape outcomes and protect lives. The lessons lingered vividly in my mind. Visibility is only valuable when paired with patience. Authority is meaningless without preparation, and arrogance always reveals its own weaknesses if you know where to look. I realized that the same invisibility I had endured for decades, the same underestimation that had been my mother's greatest weapon, was now my greatest advantage. I moved through spaces she once ruled, unseen but fully in command, and no one could challenge me because I had learned that being underestimated is not a curse. It is a strategy. I walked past the familiar streets, the wet asphalt glistening under the city lights, and I finally allowed myself a private, deep exhale. There was no celebration, no applause, no grand announcement. The world did not need to know. Victory, I understood, was most satisfying when it required no witnesses. It was the calm certainty of having dismantled what had once seemed untouchable, and knowing that it could never rise again. My grandmother was safe. The people depending on me were protected. And the woman who had tried to erase me was now accountable to the law she had ignored for decades. I reached my apartment, the familiar hum of the city below serving as a reminder that life never stops, that challenges will always come, and that power, if wielded correctly, must be maintained with vigilance. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt steady, resolute, free. I had transformed humiliation into authority, invisibility into leverage, and betrayal into empowerment. I had become a force that no charm, wealth, or ego could intimidate. I was Nova William, and for the first time, I existed on my own terms, untouchable, prepared, and fully seen. And as I looked out over the skyline, the rain reflecting the city lights like 1,000 tiny victories, I smiled softly. There was no joy in vengeance. There was only clarity, power, and the unshakable understanding that being underestimated is often the greatest advantage of all. The shadows I had walked through all those years had not broken me, they had made me untouchable. I had turned the past into armor, the present into action, and the future into mine. And in that quiet triumph, I finally understood what it meant to be truly free.